Throughout this debate, my opponent has attempted to use manipulative tactics to try and derive you from the main purpose of this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to vote pro for this debate as my opponent has essentially defeated himself with his own arguments. One, my opponent has violated rules, including his own judging criteria. As I said in my round one, both debaters were supposed to be respectful of the known meaning of this debate. My opponent has argued semantics in that he continues to claim that decisions don't have to be made by a political or government entity, when that was the obvious and discussed purpose of this debate. My opponent continues to derive and original arguments into manipulation attempts to steer the resolution away from its intended purpose. The intended purpose was simply to prove philosophically determine whether it was possible or not to prove universally that something is either right or wrong, which I have proven that it isn't. My opponent attempts to argue certain aspects from his perspective point of view, but what he should have been arguing for this entire debate was that right or wrong answers to political decisions are essential for whatever reasons. In my final clarification, I also asked my opponent not to argue bias or ridiculous policies, which he agreed to do, and then proceeded to make a genocide argument which clearly contradicted himself entirely. Next, my opponent violates his own judging criteria. In his judging criteria of topicality, he says arguments are preferable if they are closest in line with the grammar of the resolution. Later on in my opponent's second round, he says it doesn't matter if it's a political decision as long as it's a polity. As you can see, my opponent has contradicted his own premise of judging criteria. In a sense, by doing this, my opponent is basically asking you to vote pro. My opponent has given me the debate for violating a clear rule and even his own principles, showing very poor conduct on his part. Now I'll go on to my opponent's own arguments before proceeding on to my own. My opponent claims that there's an extensional drop with the word any, saying that he has disproven it contextually with his examples. However, my opponent has not provided any impacting arguments for nationwide political disputes, proving that one is more right than the other. So there actually isn't any extensional drops, and I have hope the judges will overlook this when evaluating their decision. I agree to his observation, too, of no locational contextualization. As I said in my political debate, my opponent has yet to prove rightness or wrongness of political debates in different locations. However, thus my opponent really needs an argument to back this point up. Please extend this. Also look to the fact that my opponent never directly makes any argument for his observation 3 of rightness versus wrongness of an action. Again, I've showed you in my last round that my opponent failed to prove how X is greater than Y, thus the argument fails. My opponent cannot just say this is an argument extension without providing any argument. So yes, this is an extension, but for me rather than my opponent, because he made no refutation here. My opponent says no empirics are needed, as he is arguing a polity not contained by a government or a political decision. This is exclusive evidence, as I have said at the beginning, of my opponent's violation of his own judging criteria, as this does not fit in closely in the context of the grammar of the resolution. Going on to his thought experiment, again, this point is rather irrelevant, as it is impossible to take in a weighing decision and choose simply that something is either a right or wrong decision. Even the probability of evaluation, we still can see the proposed benefits of the other side, which would essentially mean that the other side is right. So what we're saying here is that we have two right answers and no wrong answers. My opponent fails to make a revealing claim in context to the resolution. My opponent's observation under consequentialism are phallatic at best. Harry's evidence is contradictory, as it is impossible to treat everyone with differences of opinion in their best interests. As this debate is to determine whether or not there is such thing as a best interest in politics, my opponent is still arguing his own opinions on specific issues rather than underlying prospects of whether some political decision can or cannot be right or wrong. Thus, this point is irrelevant. Even his dwarf's evidence is contradictory because it takes a utilitarianism aspect of morality. Morality is dropped from this debate as agreed by my opponent, given that it's impossible to simply determine a political decision answer given dwarf's evidence. Going on to his individual scenarios. My opponent says that he's not trying to bias you because he's citing historical events. However, these historical events of crime against humanity don't contain specific political references to today's political debates. My opponent brings them up in order to derail the topic off the agreed subject, and by doing so, it violates the rules in an attempt to use generic examples of someone's morality. Again, Americans generally disagree with the outlined points my opponent brings up, and but that is not what we're trying to argue. However, even then, these arguments are politically condoned, making it irrelevant just like all the other subpoints in his individual scenarios. My opponent then says that the government is giving the arms to militias to do whatever mass extermination they want. However, at the same time, mass extermination is illegal, and the actions of the government members doing this aren't condoned by the actual government. To simplify, no government actually made some decision saying to go exterminate a mass of humans for no apparent reason. Next, the Holocaust. There's no direct governmental or political group supporting mass murder. Even my opponent is supporting those who do believe in it. It still correlates a violation in direct response to my last clarification, again showing poor conduct of the con. As for the rest of his subpoints, I simply don't have time to include them in the video. For arguments against them, you could probably look to a separate video, but it won't actually be considered part of the debate. I'm going to do this because he is basically saying the same thing with all of these little subpoints, and I don't want to make repeat arguments. Going on to his contention 3 of fiscal responsibility. My opponent says I dropped this cold. Actually, what I did was prove how irrelevant this argument really was. My opponent is arguing without a doubt that fiscal responsibility is necessary, which completely leaves out the other side of a political debate, if you can really call it that. I really don't understand where my opponent is trying to go here, nor do I really think he does. This argument does not touch down on the resolution in the slightest and goes practically nowhere in trying to prove that a political debate can be right or wrong. Basically, all it is a rant by my opponent on a topic of interest from his point of view. This doesn't really do much for the debate, however. Going on to my own case, first my contention of effectiveness. My opponent attempts to confuse the audience with wordplay around non-mutuality. Specifically, he never provides an how the opposing side is non-mutual, while they both gain significant benefits. Thus, my opponent hasn't attacked this contention of mutual effectiveness, and we can extend it across the flow. This argument was important because it best upholds the resolution in that if both sides can prove to be even a hint of effectiveness, then that means they have a hint of right in them. Even if one right is significantly outweighs another right, at the end of the day, both decisions are still relatively right. Going on to my contention 2. My opponent says unknown results don't negate the future results. Again, my opponent proves that he doesn't know what he's talking about. You can see this as he easily stumbles around to find the right word to explain what he's talking about. We're not going to talk about unknown results. What I'm saying is, with this whole point is that the fact that people are always going to have such strong opinions and that will never be a conjoined society of beliefs, we can safely assume that people in their ignorance will continue to believe their beliefs as long as there is sufficient reasoning and evidence to do so. And what I'm saying is, due to the fact that there is sufficient logic and reasoning for either side, we have some hard proofs that there will never be any distinction between right or wrong. My opponent brings up the healthcare debate as an example to derail this point. However, I fail to see the relevance of this at all. Just because something is extended and eventually an overall decision is made doesn't necessarily mean the other side was correct as well. Going on to my subpoint of MLMs, he says there's basically unmutual bondings. This doesn't make sense, though, as I prove there are negative and positive factors to both sides, which makes it mutual rather than non-mutual. Please disregard this argument and extend it. And next, my contention 3, where my opponent talks about heliocentric theories. He says, we can make theories based on statistics. Yes, this is true, but it doesn't actually tie into the example you're trying to use about whether or not the world was round or flat. The theory saying that the world was round was much more thought-based with statistics, while the theory that the world was flat was more of a claim based on unknown knowledge. This argument definitely contains a fallacy. My opponent uses an example of global warming as a theory based on statistics. However, the opposers of global warming also have relevant theories based on statistics proving otherwise. Thus, this point is ineffective. His economic argument as well is irrelevant, as just because certain situations have worked in the past doesn't mean they will never work. My opponent cannot say faithfully that the same result will always occur. Please overlook this argument as well when judging. And last, my opponent says that he's not trying to make a universal claim, but rather a comparative claim. My question is, what is the difference? You're making a universal comparative claim, which in the end still comes out with both sides having equal benefits. Now I'll go on to my voters. Given my opponent has violated the judging criteria, as I have mentioned at the beginning of the debate, it is absolutely essential that we vote pro for this round. My opponent has violated rules, agreed, and concedes to many of my arguments, and overall shows poor conduct through the use of using semantics and bringing aspects of morality into the debate, when it was clearly agreed upon by both debaters that this should be disallowed. Also, according to his own judgment criteria about the grammar of the resolution, he almost tells you to vote pro. I have proven that while both sides have some rightness to them, it's impossible to say that one is a wrong decision. Which proves that there's no such thing as an unmutual political decision. With all that said, I really hope you guys enjoyed this debate, and I hope the audience and my opponent both had a fun watching this, and I strongly urge you to vote pro. Thank you very much.